Benchmark, the voice of business. Presented by LMD.
On this edition of Benchmark, former senior diplomat and UN Under-Secretary General for Disarmament Affairs Jayantha Dhanapala outlines his wish list for Sri Lanka in 2017. Then, Nielsen's Managing Director Sharang Pan analyzes the reasons behind the BCI slump to a 41-month low. And LMD columnist Shiran Fernando wraps up the show with his take on Sri Lanka's macro outlook. That's the lineup for Benchmark.
Hello and Happy New Year. Welcome to the very first edition of Benchmark for 2017. I'm Savitri Rodrigo. As is customary, our first guest for every New Year has always been Mr. Jayantha Dhanapala, and this year it's no exception. He is the former UN Under-Secretary General for Disarmament Affairs, a former senior diplomat, and also the president of Pugwash Conferences on Sciences and World Affairs, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1995. We're today going to discuss a range of subjects, starting off with his wish list for 2017. Welcome as always, Mr. Dhanapala, and a Happy New Year to you.
Thank you, Savitri, and a Happy New Year to you and to the viewers of your program.
Now, million-dollar question, what is your wish list for 2017?
Well, for Sri Lanka and my fellow citizens, I always wish the very, very best. But first of all, we must make an assessment of the current situation. It is 2 years since the Sirisena Wickremesinghe government was elected in January 8th last year, as well as in August of last year. So 2 years after that momentous event, we've had a transition from a much more democratic and freer atmosphere. But that alone is not a sufficient achievement. It is important to have concrete results. And we have had some concrete results in terms of a restoration of democracy through the 19th Amendment and many other promises, and also a number of very useful liberalization policies with regard to human rights and with regard to the economy. But what is now important in 2017 is a consolidation of that process. And the first and foremost task is the making of a new constitution, which was a promise made to the people in the mandate given on the 8th of January and in August 2015. Whether that will be achieved or not is still in question, because the various 6 subcommittees in the Parliamentary Select Committee have submitted their reports. There is still not a consensus that has emerged from amongst the political parties. That is vital. And if that is done, then we can have a 2/3 majority in Parliament and a referendum in the country. But what I fear is that the joint opposition are trying to stoke up racism and ethnic hatreds in the wake of these suggestions with regard to constitutional reform, and are deliberately blocking a consensus. That is a very unfortunate thing. We are going to relive the battles that we had in Sri Lanka post-independence, which led to the conflict of 26 years. We don't want that reenacted.
You know, you mentioned the anniversary of the coalition government, which actually swept into power because of their stance on governance. Absolutely. Do you feel that in your assessment of governance, is there enough being done? Has it sort of achieved its purpose and achieved its purpose?
Well, there is an atmosphere and there is a framework of legislation that is conducive to the new changes. But that is not enough. That legislation must be pursued and must be, in fact, implemented. For example, there is still a lot of hate speech going on, including by members of the Buddhist clergy against minority ethnic groups and minority religious groups. That is absolutely flagrant. We have seen abominable videos being circulated on social media, and the kind of language that those priests have used is really condemnable, and we should really have the Mahanayakas come up in a Sanghadikarana and find fault with these monks. Besides which, the lay authorities, that is the government, must find ways and means to prosecute them in the courts of law, because this is a very bad example being set to all future generations, and we are going to relive the tragedies that we had in the past in Sri Lanka if this is unchecked.
What is the reason for this sort of silence by both the government and the hierarchy of the Buddhist clergy in not actually addressing this elephant in the room?
I think there is a false belief that soft peddling around this subject will help it to go away. That does not happen. Racists and extremists are only encouraged by this silence. They have to be treated very, very firmly. Otherwise, you will see the incidents of Beruwala, once again Alutgamma repeated. We will see the incidents of 1983 repeated if we don't watch out. So you have to nip it in the bud, and firm action at the courts will be necessary, and also very clear statements from the President and from the Prime Minister and the Cabinet are very necessary. I must say the joint opposition are acting very irresponsibly, and the former President himself is really stoking up fires of communalism. But it has to be done at the national level by the religious groups themselves, so that we don't allow people to grow up in compartments in Sri Lanka. They must grow up in a wider community, mixing freely with each other and understanding that being in a different religious group does not mean being alien. You are really a Sri Lanka citizen practicing a different religion and belonging to a different ethnic group, but still you are Sri Lankans. And that concept of Sri Lankanness has yet got to be inculcated, even though we got our independence in 1948. It was fractured as a result of our colonial experience, because the divide and rule policy was advantageous to the colonial rulers. But it is high time now, so many decades after we got independence, that we should once again resume a national united identity.
The Global Youth Development Index for 2016, compiled by the Commonwealth Secretariat, ranks Sri Lanka 31 from 186 countries. What is your assessment of Sri Lankan youth? Do you think they are being adequately leveraged?
Well, first of all, I think we have a very bright asset in our youth. They are competent, they are capable, they have the world at their fingertips because of the IT revolution. And many of them are IT competent, even though an IT instrument might be expensive. They can go into IT shops and have access to a world of knowledge, which my generation did not have. So they have all the advantages, and I think they have the mental capacity. They have media open to them. They have telephones. They have mobile phones. But of course, with IT also comes dangers, and they have to be guided in the use of this new technology. I think we have a very rich asset in our youth population. I think they are 26% of the population, and they have great opportunities, much greater opportunities than we had in terms of the choice of professions available to them. We must ensure that they are guided properly, and of course for that the economy must create opportunities. You can't expect a student to come up after 13 years of education and face the futility of not having a job. That is very frustrating for it, and we have already had youth insurgencies in the past because of youth unemployment. We cannot go that route again. We have to create meaningful job opportunities to absorb the brilliance of our students and the competence of our young generation.
Well, that was the first half of our very first program for 2017. But we'll be back to discuss the rise of populism across the globe, as well as the achievement of world peace with Jayantha Dhanapala. Stay with us.
When we entered the industry in 1995, a new star was born as a fully owned subsidiary of People's Bank. For those seeking to grow their businesses, PLC provided the seed. We are not only Sri Lanka's #1 leasing company, but also the largest non-banking financial institution. Welcome to a new dawn for the nation. Introducing People's Leasing and Finance, PLC. We understand that savings provide for life's special moments. That's why we were the first bank to introduce an incentivized savings scheme, Pathum Vimana. We changed how a nation felt about savings because we believe in banking beyond transactions. HNB, your partner in progress.
Thank you for staying with Benchmark. We are continuing our discussion with the former UN Under-Secretary General for Disarmament Affairs, Jayantha Dhanapala. Mr. Dhanapala, looking at equality among the citizenry, do you think greater equality has been achieved?
I think in principle we have reasserted the fundamental equality of all citizens before the law. In practice there may be omissions that are taking place, but they can always be challenged in a court of law. And we have been transparent with regard to the international community in the Human Rights Council and other instruments of the United Nations. For example, the recent Committee Against Torture. We have been able to submit our reports with absolute regularity and transparency again. And in the media, there has been an exposure of any acts of inequality. So I think we are in a much better situation than we were a few years ago. But of course, we have to make improvements. It's not enough to be satisfied to say we were better than the previous regime. It's not good enough. We have certain ideal situations as a democratic society. And I'm sure that there are incidents where individuals may still claim that there has been acts of inequality or discrimination. Wherever that happens, that must be brought out into the open and addressed.
Do you think civil society is proactive enough in getting what is rightfully theirs?
Civil society have all the equipment necessary to play its role vigorously in a democratic society. We have now got the Right to Information Act. We have still got to have the apparatus to implement it fully, but we have that legislation. We have transparency, we have openness in information media, both in terms of the visual media as well as in the print media, and we have social media, which is a very active instrument. And I think, for example, videos showing various discriminatory acts go viral overnight. And that's something that didn't exist 10, 20 years ago. So civil society has all the information at its fingertips.
In the WJP Rule of Law Index for 2016, Sri Lanka is ranked 68th out of 113 countries. Now, this is still below the halfway mark. What are the key concerns when it comes to law and order in Sri Lanka?
I think we must be unafraid to act, whatever the personalities may be. First of all, I think we are very, very slow in pursuing action against those who are responsible for financial corruption, money laundering, and other egregious mishandling of public expenditure under the last government. The people, including myself, cannot understand why it has taken so long to have prosecutions launched in the courts of law. Of course, even the most heinous criminal has to have access to justice and a defense lawyer, but prosecution has not been launched in many of these cases. And there is a lurking suspicion in the minds of our people that there is some kind of collusion between the incumbent government and the previous government, a kind of attempt to protect each other because they are both from the same political profession that we know have not been very outstanding in Sri Lanka in their service to the people without corruption. So I think that's a problem that we have, the failure to go ahead and prosecute and make sure that the law of the land is implemented.
In the context of Brexit, and in the US presidential elections, we're going to see Donald Trump take over the White House soon, and also some upcoming elections in some of the European countries. How do you view the rise of populism across the globe?
I view it with great alarm. I spoke on this subject at the Gamini Korea oration last year, and I've also written on the subject recently. My visits abroad also confirm that this is a development that is likely to be repeated in France next year or this year, and perhaps in other countries in Europe. I think we must remember that this is essentially a neo-fascist phenomenon. And also it's good to remind ourselves that Hitler was elected to power. So the fact that elections take place and these extremist populist groups are elected does not make them necessarily democratic. I think what is important is the content of their policies and the fact that they appeal to a particular strata of society that are disaffected and that really identify themselves as being very much for particular minorities. We have to see how Mr. Trump will rule, because how he campaigned is different from how he will rule. And certainly his first appointments indicate that he is going into a really pragmatic mode, and he is allying with business leaders who have had experience of dealing with Russian Federation and with other governments, and so it may be that he will be driven to a more pragmatic exercise of policy, in the same way as Nixon was able to open the doors to China after a very long period of a freeze in relations between the People's Republic of China and the United States.
Just on Trump policy, do you think that given what we are seeing right now, that he's opening up to Russia is a good thing for the rest of the world?
It's a good thing for the rest of the world because for 6 years now we have had no nuclear disarmament agreements between the Russian Federation and the United States, which together own 93% of the nuclear warheads in the world. And unless they begin to reduce those nuclear warheads, we are not going to see a likelihood of nuclear weapons ever being abolished in the world. The United Nations last year adopted a resolution where by overwhelming majority the non-nuclear weapon states, with some abstentions from nuclear weapon states and nuclear weapon states allies, agreed that there should be negotiations commenced immediately for having an abolition of nuclear weapons. Now clearly the nuclear weapon states will fight that tooth and nail, but at least a step has been made, and that's the view of the overwhelming majority of the countries in the world in the United Nations. But with the United States and Russia having a dialogue on this issue, I think it's a much better situation that we have. Besides which, we are going to have some stability with regard to European situation and European security. We are going to have some stability with regard to the international oil price, because already having sanctions against Russia has caused problems. Of course, some of the threat perceptions that Europeans have because of the annexation of Crimea and the situation in Ukraine, the Baltics countries are very, very nervous. They have to be allayed, and that can only be allayed by better relations between the Russian Federation and the United States. And I think that is coming.
So as a final question, where do you see Sri Lanka at the end of 2017?
I see Sri Lanka continuing on the path of a rededicated democracy, a country with a vibrant economy, once again developing to its full potential, where the private sector and the public sector are united in ensuring the economic rights of all our citizens, where there is a general upliftment of all sectors of society, in trying to ensure that Sri Lanka's valuable assets are marketed abroad to the best of our ability and to the maximum profit of the Sri Lankan economy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dhanapala, and wishing you once again a very happy new year.
Thank you very much.
So there it is, Jayantha Dhanapala's wish list for 2017 and where Sri Lanka might be by the end of 2017 and everything in between. On the other side, Anushan Selvaraja will be joining us with more tidings for the new year. He is wishing you a very peaceful new year.
Sri Lanka's #1 leasing company is now the nation's largest and highest rated finance company with 2 international ratings. Let us move the nation as one with People's Leasing and Finance PLC. Sri Lanka's #1 leasing company is now the nation's largest and highest rated finance company with 2 international ratings. Let us move the nation as one with People's Leasing and Finance PLC.
Nearly 60% of all businesses in our country are SMEs. Some of our most growth-oriented financial solutions have been customized to serve this sector. That's why we have invested over 500 billion rupees to support the backbone of our economy. Because we believe in banking beyond transactions. HNB, your partner in progress.
Welcome back to Benchmark. I'm Anushan Selvaraja. Now for a closer look at the latest on the Business Confidence Index. Joining me is the Managing Director of Nielsen, Sharang Pant. Welcome back to the show, Sharang. Now, just to start off with, the BCI slumped further to its lowest level now since mid-2013. Now, what are the sensitivities behind this downslide?
2016, I would say, has been a year of disappointment. After the high in 2015 and the relatively stable first few months of 2016, we've seen a big fluctuation in the BCI. A lot of it is driven by the unstable policies, the tax rule changes that have been coming in. While the World Bank has made a note of reforms that the Sri Lankan government has brought in, still a lot needs to be done in the private investment front and opportunities for growth for all. Now, as a result, we see the index dropping to its lowest level of 117, which is only after July 2013, wherein we saw a level of 111. The businesses feel that there's still a lot to be done in terms of clarity of tax rules and administration, and that's a reason why the index has kept falling.
So where do respondents stand in terms of our economic prospects?
About 35% of the respondents say that the economy is going to deteriorate in the next 12 months. This number stood at a low of 26% in the last month of November. So that's the kind of change that we see. Again, it's to do with the changes in tax rules and probably the unfriendly budget which is causing this drop.
Right. How do they view the business and investment climate then?
On business sentiments, about 29% of the respondents feel that their business is going to do worse in the next 12 months or so. And what's worrying is about 33% of the respondents feel that the immediate quarter is going to be challenging for them on the business fronts, in terms of making profits. Now, when it comes to investments, about 1 in 4 or 40% of the business leaders say that they do not plan to make further investments. The investment scenario in Sri Lanka looks bleak. When talking about the workforce, about 60% of the leaders say that they do not plan to make any changes on the workforce front.
Thank you very much for joining us, Sharang.
Thank you.
That was the Managing Director of Nielsen, Sharang Pant. We'll be right back after a short commercial break. Stay tuned.
When we entered the industry in 1995, a new star was born as a fully owned subsidiary of People's Bank. For those seeking to grow their businesses, PLC provided the seed. We are not only Sri Lanka's #1 leasing company, but also the largest non-banking financial institution. Welcome to a new dawn for the nation. Introducing People's Leasing and Finance, PLC. Gami Pubudua, our microfinance offering, makes it possible for the youth of this country who have a viable business plan but lack the funds to realize their dreams. We are committed to grassroots level entrepreneur development because we believe in banking beyond transactions. HNB, your partner in progress.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Anushin Selvaraja. Now for a closer look at the latest on the economy. Joining me is economist and LMD columnist Shiran Fernando. Welcome to Benchmark for the first show of the year, Shiran. Now, what was your assessment of Sri Lanka's economic performance in 2016?
Well, in 2016, I think it was largely a rebalancing year because a lot of the politics took over the economics in 2015. And the rebalancing was, I would say, mostly in the second half with the IMF coming in. With the new governor coming in, so a lot of stability came after that. Not much was done in terms of policy and improving policy consistency and things like that for investors, but I think a bit of the groundwork has been done laid for the next 2 years as well. So a rebalancing year more than a dramatic turn of events, I would say.
Will Budget 2017 be successful, Shiran?
The early signs show that it is. Compared to last year, I think there is less loopholes or less issues with certain of the macro things, because I think this with the IMF on board as well, a lot of the measures have been sort of passed through, they might feel. But there are certain industries, I think, where taxes are a bit uncertain. So those things will need to be ironed out because certain sectors are taxed at a disadvantage, or that will distort the market. So those things need to be ironed out as with usual budgets. But overall, I think it was very positive for the macroeconomy because revenue is projected to go up. So if that is the case and if these things are legislated, then I think the budget, that will be the success of the budget. And you will have to, the finance minister and the Ministry of Finance will have to rely less on things like VAT, which will burden the public.
How has the economy fared in terms of the checks and balances recommended by the IMF?
So I think it's very early on in the program, and the first review was done before the big disbursement in December. So even though it's a 1.5 billion loan, I think it's dispersed over 2 installments every year. What this program with this review has sort of done is it's been a bit more realistic. So it's not as harsh as a lot of people thought that they've set up indicators, Sri Lankan government needs to meet it, but the IMF has recognized that there have been difficulties in particular implementing VAT, in particular in implementing other measures as well, which they had timelines for. In particular, for example, I think the delisting of Sri Lankan Airlines. So they recognize that the political constraints have been there as well and provided room for Sri Lanka to maybe catch up later. So I think that's a good thing for the Sri Lankan economy as well as the central bank. In terms of interest rates and exchange rate, I think they've been pretty satisfactory with what the monetary policy has done in the recent 6 months. But I think on the exchange rate is the key part because they've wanted the central bank to build up reserves. Even though the program has come into effect, you've seen that volatility in reserves, and I think in November it fell to about 5.6 billion. So this is the IMF program sort of advises the central bank to build these reserves up by purchasing dollars in the market, which may have an impact on the rupee. So that's sort of the recommendation, I think, if you were to look at the review as a whole. But the other things, I think they are very understanding of the constraints here. And I think they recognize certain things in the budget that were good as well. So overall, I would say it was a very balanced and satisfactory scorecard for the government as well as the IMF.
Thank you for joining us, Shiran.
Pleasure.
That was economist and LMD columnist Shiran Fernando. Thank you for watching Benchmark, and we wish you all a great year ahead.